second mode of time, which is linear, is symbolized by the concept of sunrise to sunset. So on Orkney, you have the sun rising in the east, setting behind those mountains every day. But where it sets behind the mountains reconciles that oscillating offset of the second mode of energy of time. And so you have effectively a non-material mode of time and a material mode of time. Now that goes along with some fairly heavy scientific concepts. There's a concept called quantum coherence. Quantum coherence is one of the biologists that I read compares it to a jazz combo, where every player in a jazz combo has ultimate latitude to play whatever they want to play, but it has to be in keeping with the theme that the entire combo is playing. And so you have two structures that are being integrated in jazz. You have that individualized mode of musicianship, but reconciled with the group dynamic of musicianship. Orkney is a physical representation of that point where the energies meet, the point at which the energies overturn. And the word Skara Brae in the Faroese language is based on roots. Actually, if you compare it to Egyptian word, Skaher Bari, means the overturned boat, the overturned boat. The idea that these orbs that communicate information back and forth between levels of consciousness are defined as to send to say hello. Let's back up a little bit. Let's go back to that superconductive domain where materializing energy first emerges. Okay, from the Dogen perspective, what creates superconductivity is the perfect alignment of all the little magnets in the domain. If you align them one way, it's called superconductive. It's where magnetism is dormant and electricity is unresisted. But if you flip all the magnets over, then you create a state called superinsulation where the reverse is true, that magnetism is unresisted and electricity is dormant. That same input of energy causes the magnet to flip. Well, we know that parallel magnetism, when all the poles of the magnets are aligned the same way, pulls together. Anti-parallel magnetism pushes apart. So when this little magnet flips over with the electrical charge in between, now suddenly they're set anti-parallel to the rest of the domain, so they start to get pushed out by anti-parallel magnetism. And as they move, they open up a dimensional space that allows the electrical charge to extend. The Dogen are saying that's what happened with our sun and the Sirius stars. They say the two Sirius stars in our sun all emerge together just exactly like that, and that over time, our sun has moved progressively farther and farther and farther away from Sirius stars as a consequence of what is essentially parallel magnetism.
Hey, Fire. Hello. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Rising from the Ashes. It is homie Romy. I'm here in a cabin in the good old hills, chilling, working a catering event. A party? Not a party, a retreat, a healing retreat, yoga and meditation. It's pretty awesome. Got hooked up with this gig, and I'm here recording this intro so we can get this episode out because this talk with Laird Scranton is awesome. it's hands down great. It's an instant classic, and it's an absolute note taker about the Skara Brae, that potential, lost civilization, the definite connection to ancient Egypt. It's wonderful. It's absolutely wonderful. All the things. It's really good, my friends. So we're here, and I want to, just say thank you guys so much for, great week last week. A lot of good feedback on the Ralph Ellis episode, and got a lot of really amazing people to open um, open up communication lines, um, and more thoughts about the ancestry and the ancestral connection between these cultures. So that's really amazing, and thank you guys for all the beautiful comments. Um, if you love the show and you want to, be more a part of the community, or like be able to reach out and, just chat about whatever interests you, make sure to join us on the Telegram group chat. It is an awesome social media platform in which we get to hang out, and it's not invasive by any means. Telegram it's a great platform. I love it. And I know I love the Telegram family that we have there, and thank you guys so much for all the insight you bring and the fun links you guys are dropping, links and videos and stories and songs. I'll be sharing my playlist on there because I love to share my music. So, that being said, if you would like to support Dan and I, and give us a little boost, so we can keep the production going and all the fun stuff, make sure to check out our merch store where we got water bottles, hats, hoodies, yoga mats, and backpacks, and a bunch of fun, awesome designs. I'm working on a couple new designs right now. We got I put the Sup Brahe shirt on there recently. It's and the shirt and the hat. It's it's our boy Tycho Brahe, who is just an awesome astronomer of antiquity. Part of the Magic Circle with John Dee and Edward Kelly. Very famous. Him and Johannes Kepler worked together. But a nice, fun and punny T-shirt that says "Sup Brahe," and then you can wear it and tell people about Tycho Brahe. It's a great conversation starter. That's why I thought it would be fun to make that as a design. And so I have an artist working on a new Tycho Brahe design that'll be like the flower of Venus, the elliptical shape of the flower of Venus. If you guys haven't looked up the flower of Venus and know what that is, definitely do that. It's a beautiful image. It's a beautiful shape that Venus makes in the sky, and it makes a lot of sense with all of the symbology tied to the planet Venus. So definitely check out the flower of Venus design, and go and check out those fun designs we got on the merch shop. And you can also, of course, join the Patreon for $3 a month and get a bunch of dope content. Beautiful podcasts that are not on the regular feed. Uh, hours, so many hours. I was gonna say hundreds of hours, and I think we are almost there, definitely. But either way, you get the point. $3 supports us. You get content um, that nobody else is getting. Exclusive goodness keeps the ball going, keeps it rolling. So, yeah, and the email is attached also to the show notes. So, if you guys want to reach out and just say hello, say what up, if you guys want to come on for a news segment, you guys want to share some family history, a story, some folklore, whatever, we'd love to have you on and talk story, all that goodness. Oh, this I have to mention. Okay, this Sunday, um, January 22nd, we will not be doing a Sunday slow burn, our live stream on YouTube, but the following Sunday, the following Sunday, my friends. Oh, strap in. We are doing a live role play live stream, meaning anybody who joins the link and wants to get on and play will make a character, a a lizard bard, that is part hobbit, part lizard, named Gary Francis from the second rock within the hollow cavern below Japan or something, Create a character, you get that part. And the people that are viewing get to make up the story as we go, one roll at a time. So it's a live action role play for the most part while streaming. It's going to be great. It's going to be epic. It's going to be hilarious. It's going to be super fun. So definitely next Sunday, I believe it's the 29th, if I'm not mistaken, Sunday the 29th. Tune into our YouTube channel and check out this live stream. It's going to be a lot of fun. And if you haven't been checking out our Sunday Slow Burn live streams, where we have large panels and go deep into specific topics, and we try to keep it on theme. Try not to go off theme too much, but life, it happens. Conversations are great. So, anyways, that's that. My friends, if you want to have some psychic or clairvoyant work with my friend SABIAH SOGARD, she is offering a discount to any of the Fire Tribe. Please go and get your psychic hygiene. I can smell your sweet spiritual body odor from here. Take a little shower with some love. And to the multiple people who have reached out to her and worked with her, isn't she a gem? Isn't she a gem? She's just lovely, isn't she? She is lovely. She's wonderful. She's good at what she does. And she just started going back to school to get more training, to become more accredited and more certified, on top of all of her awesome certifications, as well as just being a massively great friend and an important person in existence. So go and check that out at visionswitch.space, and her link will be in the show notes as well. So, the news segment this week is going to be, I have a book. I have a stack full of poetry books here next to me that is a part of this the retreat center here in California. By the way, the name of this retreat center is the Toll House, TOLL House. If you guys want to check it out on Google for whatever reason, if you guys live in California, it's a great place to come and spend a getaway weekend on a property with no cell phone service, so you can really tune out. They got beautiful yurts. This cabin I'm staying in is epic. I'm sitting underneath a heated blanket with my guitar. Yes, so it's awesome. The stars are great. Anyways, check it out. That's where I'm at. I'm at the Toll House. They got some complimentary poetry books here, and I'm just gonna read. We're gonna do some bibliomancy on this, and we're gonna pull a poem from each book. It's gonna be awesome. So strap in. That's the RFTA news. We'll get that going, and then we'll pop into this amazingly epic conversation with Laird Scranton. Thank you, Fire Tribe. You are sweet, sweet babies. Okay, here we are. We're going to read these poems. We're going to read these serps from this stack of books over here. We got 5 different little poetry books. And what I did is I kind of flicked, and they're kind of like when you pull tarot card, you flip to a page, and when you stop, that's where you read. where it feels good. And so you really got to intuitively try to ask the book where to stop. So that's what we're doing right now. We got some good books and see what we pull out. I just made sure that it was starting on a new chapter or a new SERP. That was it. That was the only thing I had. So they're all going to be fresh and hopefully mean something to each and every one of you amazing existers out there. One fun thing I wanted to say. So this is a new moon. We're passing through a new moon right now, and I'm calling it just for the sake of this past couple days of really great synchronicities and all of these celestial lining ups of planets and passing throughs and retrogrades and what have yous. I'm calling this moon. I'm calling it the regenerative moon. Mainly because I just found out that in Florida, and most likely other places as well, but this gentleman was telling me a story about these Floridian crabs, that they will harvest the crab, but they'll throw back into the ocean the claw or a claw, and from that claw, a crab regenerates. Okay, so the rest of the body grows from that claw and creates a new crab. Why is that interesting? Well, for many reasons, obviously, but one being that crabs are connected to the moon via the archetype of the zodiac sign Cancer, which is ruled by the moon. And this quality of regeneration is insatiably connected to the moon and her regenerative powers, those regenerative properties. So, for the sake of learning about this crab conundrum, I am calling this moon the regenerative moon, a time for regeneration, resetting, refirming, re-establishing, and grabbing the proverbial bull by those saucy horns and getting strapped up to be beautiful fruit to bloom. That's what this moon is to me. So wanted to share that with you guys. The first SERP we're going to be reading is from a book called Pause, Rest, Be, Stillness Practices for Courage in Times of Change. This chapter is called The Underbelly. We can tuck and hide so much to make ourselves more lovable until we can find the parts of us that need the most light, the most real love, the most nourishment to a dark corner of our being. One day, while breathing, meditating, and repeating, I can, I will, I must deeply love and nourish myself, a little voice of wisdom said, self-love is this. My hand was literally at my underbelly, the place that has morphed into discolored, loose, scarred skin since giving birth, the place that already had so many war markings before that. This, I silently ask. Not this. No one loves this. Voice of wisdom. Yes, this. Absolutely this. This is your way to self-love. Self-love is seeing fully, with tenderness and compassion, that part of ourselves that we have learned to believe is most unworthy of being seen, unlovable, or flawed. It is accepting, touching, feeling, tending to, singing to, gazing completely at the place that others have turned their eyes away from. It is wanting what has been unwanted within us. It is holding our underbelly, or wherever that place is that we've experienced that no one loves this. It is holding and loving that part of ourselves that is just the beginning. What place within you are you just beginning to love? What place within you do you believe is still untouchable, unlovable, or in need of hiding? How can you reveal more of that place to yourself? That was from Pause, Rest, Be, Stillness Practices for Courage in Times of Change, written by Octavia F. Rahim. Up next, we have a classic, The Essential Rumi, translation by Coleman Barks. And we open up to page 220, and the story is titled The Snake Catcher and the Frozen Snake. Listen to this and hear the mystery inside. A snake catcher went into the mountains to find a snake. He wanted a friendly pet and one that would amaze audiences, but he was looking for a reptile, something that has no knowledge of friendship. It was winter. In the deep snow, he saw a frighteningly huge dead snake. He was afraid to touch it, but he did. In fact, he dragged the thing into Baghdad, hoping people would pay to see it. This is how foolish we've become. A human being is a mountain rage. Snakes are fascinated by us, yet we sell ourselves to look at a dead snake. We are like beautiful satin used to patch burlap. Come see the dragon I killed and hear the adventures. That's what he announced, and a large crowd came. But the dragon was not dead, just dormant. He set up his show at a crossroads. The ring of gawking people got thicker, everybody on a tiptoe. Men and women, noble and peasant, all packed together, unconscious of their differences. It was like the resurrection. He began to unwind the thick ropes and remove the cloth coverings he wrapped it so well in. Some little movement. The hot Iraqi sun had woken the terrible life. The people near started screaming, "Panic! Panic!" The dragon tore easily and hungry, loose, killing many instantly. The snake catcher stood there, frozen. What have I brought out of the mountains? The snake braced against a post and crushed the man and consumed him. The snake is your animal soul. When you bring it into the hot air of your wanting energy, warmed by that and by the prospect of power and wealth, it does massive damage. Leave it in the snow mountains. Don't expect to oppose it with quietness and sweetness and wishing. The naffs don't respond to those, and they can't be killed. It takes a Moses to deal with such a beast, to lay it back, and to make it lie down into the snow. There was no Moses then. Hundreds of thousands died. The next is called Polishing the Mirror. When Abu Bakr met Muhammad, he said, "This is not a face that lies." Abu Bakr was one whose bowl had fallen from the roof. There's no hiding the fragrance that comes from an aesthetic. A polished mirror cannot help reflecting. Muhammad once was talking to a crowd of chieftains, princes with great influence, when a poor blind man interrupted him. Muhammad frowned and said to the man, "Let me attend to these visitors. This is a rare chance, whereas you are already my friend. We'll have ample time." Then someone nearby said, "The blind man may be worth 100 kings. Remember that proverb, human beings are minds?" World power means nothing. Only the unsayable, jeweled inner life matters. Muhammad replied, "Do not think that I am concerned with being acknowledged by these authorities. If a beetle moves toward rosewater, it proves that the solution is diluted. Beetles love dung, not rose essence. If a coin is eager to be tested by the touchstone, that coin itself may be a touchstone. A thief loves the night. I am day. I reveal essences. A calf thinks God is a cow. A donkey's theology changes when someone new pets it and gives it what it wants. I am not a cow or thistles for camels to browse on. People who insult me are only polishing the mirror." That was the essential Rumi. Up next, we're reading from the Catalog of Unabashed Gratitude by author Ross Gay. This is page 72, title chapter, Come On. My mother is not the wings, nor the bird, but the moon. Across the laced hands of the nest, the palm on a fever's dreamer's brow. She was born a crab, waving the twin flags of her pinchers. That's one of those poetry lies. Truth is, my poor mom's hands bruised on our butts, so that was the end of that. And when the monk slapped her ass, she didn't kick him down the stairs, but slipped the saffron tail in her pocket. Truth is, my mother's brave as a bison. For years, she dragged her hooves through the ash of her heart, head down, steam rising in ghost from her pelt. Years were nary a blade of glass, nary a bird song. But one day a small seed took hold, then another. Soon beetles and spiders came back, and then the birds were chatting in the new growth. Act right now, a family of elk crosses a stream, and behind them on a hillside, a galaxy of wildflowers shimmers, and hollers, "Come on!" That was page 72 of the Catalog of Unabashed Gratitude by Ross Gay. Up next, we're reading David White, Essentials. Page 37, The Sea in You. When I wake under the moon, I do not know who I have become unless I move closer to you, obeying the give and take of the earth as it breathes the slender length of your body, so that in breathing with the tide that breathes in you, and moving with you as you come and go, and following you, half in light and half in dark, I feel the first firm edge of my floating palm, and then trace the pale lights of your shoulder, to the faint moonlit shadow of your smooth cheek, and drawing my finger through the pearl water of your skin, I sense the breath on your lips, touch, and then warm the finest, furthest, most unknown edge of my sense of self. So that I come to you under the moon as if I had swum under the deepest arch of the ocean, to find you living where no one could possibly live, and to feel you breathing where no one could possibly breathe, and I touch your skin as I would touch a pale, whispering spirit of the tides, that my arms try to hold with the wrong kind of strength, and my lips try to speak with the wrong kind of love, and I follow you through the ocean night, listening for your breath, and my helpless calling to you as I should, and I lie next to you in my sleep as I would next to the sea, overwhelmed by the rest that arrives in me, and by the weight that is taken from me, and what by morning is left on the shore of my waking joy. That was page 37, The Sea and You by David White, Essentials. The next piece we're going to be reading is our final piece. And this is from a book called How to Love the World, Poems of Gratitude and Hope. Edited by James Cruz. Okay, page 49. This is a poem by Paula Gordon Lepp titled Notions. Look at the silver lining, they say, but what if instead I pluck it off and use that tensile strand to bind myself to those things I do not want to lose sight of? Families knit together by evening walks, board games, laughter, the filament fixing us to friends, no matter the distance apart, a braid of gratitude for small kindnesses, a thin gauge wire of loss. Let me twist that lining around my finger. It's a silvery silvery glint of a reminder of just how quickly life can change. I will remember to love more. I will remember to give more. I remember to be still. I will knot the string tightly so it won't slip away, so I won't forget. All right, we're going to do a live action bibliomancy pick just for you guys. Final poem from this book here. Catherine Hunt, The Newborns. All through the night, all through the long, witless hallways of my sleep, from my hospital bed I heard the newborn babies cry, bewildered, between worlds, like new arrivals anywhere, unacquainted with the names of things. That afternoon, a kind nurse named Laura had taken me for a stroll to exercise the red line of my wound. We stopped by the nursery window, and a flannel-swathed boy in a clear plastic cradle was pushing to the glass. We peered at him and said, "Welcome, you've come to Earth." We laughed and shook our heads. All through the night, all through the drug-spangled rapture of my dreams, I heard the newborn babies sing, first one, then another, the fierce beginning of their lament, that bright hiss, those soft octaves of wonder. Well, there you have it. Bunch of poems, all from these sweet books, and some of them were kind of spot on. Pretty cool. Especially with the moon and silver linings and the crabs. So, I hope some of those were good enough for you guys' high, exquisite poetry standards. And get ready for some incredible juice, some gravy brought by our guest today, Laird Scranton, talking about his awesome work on the hidden civilization of Skara, Brae. Until next week, my friends, enjoy Don't forget to share this episode with some friends. Don't forget to support RFTA. Thank you so much. Join the Patreon, of course. And without further ado, the interview with Laird Scranton.
All right. Hello, Fire Tribe. Welcome to
Rising
From the Ashes. I'm Danny Unaki Dan.
I'm the homie Romy. Hello, hello. Good morning, sir.
Hello, hello. Today we are here with the infamous Laird Scranton. How you doing, Laird?
I'm doing great. I've been looking forward to this. Thanks for inviting me to come on.
Oh, thank you so much. Since it's your first time on the show, can you give people a little bit of background about yourself? How did you end up getting into discovering, or not discovering, but wanting to research into Skara Brae, and what is kind of your other studies and how you got into your profession?
Okay. My degree is in English from Vassar College. My profession was working as a custom software designer for businesses on a line of IBM machines called the I-Series line. I worked for about 200 different companies. So my background is in symbols and in sort of conceptualization of things. In the mid 1990s, my wife had read a book called Unexplained by Jerome Clark, where every chapter in the book is focused on some mystery in the world that hasn't been solved yet. And one of those chapters, she recommended the book to me, and one of the chapters was about a modern day African tribe, a primitive tribe that lives way out in the desert, 8 hours distant from anything we consider to be civilized. And the African tribe knew some things they shouldn't know about astronomy without access to equipment. They knew that the brightest star in the night sky, which is Sirius, is actually a star system. That there are at least two stars there. That I would say there may be a third body there. They knew the correct orbital period for the two stars. They knew other details about the system that they reasonably shouldn't know without telescopes, at least. And even with a telescope, you can't readily see the second star in that system because it sits in the glare of the first star. So I started to explore that. I thought, wow, wherever this goes is going to be interesting. Now, the official response to that reports of that tribe were that clearly this tribe had access to some modern scientists who conveyed this knowledge to them, and they just repeated it. But had those critics looked just a little bit deeper, they would have realized that the Dogon information is given using ancient Egyptian words that have been around since around 2600 BC. And so the chances of any modern scientist expressing the concepts using those words seems pretty unlikely. Also, that star system knowledge is really the tip of the iceberg in terms of what the Dogon represent scientifically. The Dogon say that they preserve a broad set of symbols, the same archetype symbols and themes and mythical storylines that Jung identified as archetypes. And the Dogons say that their symbols describe how a tribal god created matter. So there was a French team of anthropologists, actually Europe, considered to be Europe's top anthropologists back in the 1930s and 40s, who took a team into Dogon country every year for 3 decades to study the tribe. And he was using cutting edge techniques like film and sound recording and things like that to try to document things from the tribe. And they produced anthropological studies that I work from. So they've documented the meanings of, among other things, they produced a Dogon dictionary. The Dogon tribe is interesting because their culture preserves elements from at least three major ancient traditions. They have civic practices like ancient Egypt. They have um, rituals like ancient Judaism, and they have a symbolic system like ancient Buddhism. But they also have a large amount of overlap with other ancient traditions, Hinduism, Kabbalism. Um, the Dogon language is technically unclassifiable because it includes 18 subgroupings of other words from other languages. You can almost track the history for the migrations of the Dogon tribe themselves based on those languages. You've got Tamil words of the Dravidian languages. You've got Turkish words. You've got ancient Egyptian words. You've got Hebrew words. You've got words that appear in the Faroese language, which is one of the ancient languages of Orkney. Now, the Dogon say, okay, the more you look at the Dogon system, the more scientifically you realize that it is. Some of it is obvious. They describe a structure like an atom that is so correctly described and diagrammed that reading Stephen Hawking's Brief History of Time, I could take a Dogon description and a Dogon drawing and separate it for a paragraph and a diagram from Hawking and not change Hawking's book.
Can I ask you a question on that really quick, if you don't mind?
Sure.
So, absolutely fascinating stuff, and the Dogon it goes incredibly deep, as obviously as your books on the topic describe. But being able to see the macro and have those explanations for such a macro without technology, and then being able to see the micro without the optic technology. Was there any through your research, was there any sort of optic technologies that you found that these people had, or that they said that they had, that they were able to describe these macro and micro findings?
One of the advantages I have, I'm working from comparative studies, which means these archetypes, Jung said, exist everywhere, pretty much. In widespread cultures in ancient times, there are elements of these archetypes that appear in many, many different cultures. So my method is to start with a single element and take a clear description on the part of one of the cultures about what the element represents, and then test that against how all the other cultures who preserved the same element understood it.
And find similarities.
Now, the Buddhists and the Dogon are in agreement that their systems represent an instructed tradition, an ancient instructed tradition. They're not claiming that they developed technology to see this stuff. They're saying that someone who thoroughly understood it in ancient times taught it to them. And so the situation is more akin to if you and I had the same math teacher in high school in different eras and met at a party, and we suddenly realized, hey, we know all the same little word problems, and we know all the same little tricks for solving an equation and all these little things, all the same terminology, not because you and I had ever met, but because we had the same teacher. So what's being described is a civilizing plan for humanity that began to be instructed around 9000 BC, where the main thrust was to try to teach us agriculture. But that civilizing plan was closely tagged to this scientific cosmology. They're trying to describe concepts of creation, and they're using the techniques of agriculture and of daily civic life to reinforce the instruction about the science. And so everything a Dogon does, the way they plow their field, the way they weave their cloth, the way they build their plan and build their villages, these are all symbolic of something that's scientific that they were taught. And so when a Dogon tribesperson steps out of their hut, everything they see in their daily life, every animal, every hut structure, every village layout, is a reminder to them, a reinforcer to them of the science they were taught. And so that whole tends to have a mnemonic value. It works to hold the system together very tightly. This is arguably the same system that was used in ancient Egypt, and we know for sure that that survived in similar form for about 3,000 years. If you believe that the Dogon came out of that same tradition, then it's held together for at least 5,000 years. Now, my process was sort of to move geographically. I began in Africa with the Dogon, then moved to Egypt, and then the focus shifted to India and Tibet and China, and then to Turkey. And then suddenly there's a jump to Orkney Island in northern Scotland. Now, the jump, I had no intention
Why?
of shifting my focus there. Well, I learned the first, how can I say this? Odd things happen to people who study this stuff.
Yeah.
I have a list as long as my arm of really, really, really odd things. Some things witnessed, some not.
Wow.
That come about. Well, one of the things I've learned to do over time is to pay attention to the random question that somebody asked me. So midway through my process of writing these books, I received an email from someone I didn't know in Australia, and he wanted to know if I knew anything about the Skara Brae village. Did I think there could be ancient Egyptian influences on Skara Brae? So I took the time to at least do some initial research into that. And my first impression was that couldn't be true because the Skara Brae village, the heyday of the Skara Brae village was hundreds of years before the rise of dynastic Egypt. And there's nobody who believes that the Egyptians could have mounted an expedition to northern Scotland, prior to dynastic times. But
that seems so
still,
out of the question.
my perspective was
so strange.
What's that?
It doesn't seem that far out of reach in my mind that a culture in general could travel a few hundred miles and cross water.
Right. No, I agree, but no one is saying that pre-dynastic Egypt had the seafaring capabilities to do that.
Okay.
What time period is pre-dynastic?
Okay. The dynastic period in Egypt starts just after 3000 BC. The Skara Brae village, the heyday of it was around 3200 BC, but it probably started by 3600 BC. And there were really interesting things going on on Orkney in that era. A group of apparent farmers, in their spare time, generationally, were building the first megalithic projects in the United Kingdom. And the Dogon they use their symbols to represent a kind of alphabet of how matter forms, a series of shapes that represent how matter emerges. In Buddhism, the beginnings of sacred geometry are expressly said to represent how space emerges. It replicates, it recapitulates how space emerges. So I'm familiar with the sequence of shapes that represents that concept. So when I started looking into situations at Skara Brae, I realized that someone had raised in stone on a human scale a person could walk through a series of megalithic sites that represented an alphabet of how matter emerges. It would be as if you arrived on Orkney and you found a set of giant carved letters, A, B, C, D, K. It wouldn't take a genius to figure out that someone was trying to represent the alphabet in stone. Well, that's essentially what these sites are. And at 3200 BC, there was a Neolithic road that connected all of these sites and led to the Skara Brae village.
Wow.
So the problem on Orkney is that it's not like ancient Egypt. Ancient Egypt, you can't walk 2 feet without tripping over a clay pot or a stone artifact of some kind. On Orkney, you have a very limited set of evidence to work from. So one of the pieces, the Skara Brae village is traditionally understood as the first farming village in the United Kingdom. It's a cluster of 8 chambers or houses that were all originally built to a single plan. And the plan is one that researchers there don't have any precedence for. They can't link it to anything. The house plan includes a small round room at one end that they call a beehive-shaped chamber. The modern researchers call it that. But there's a round room at one end. There's a square room in the center. There are two rectangular rooms on the side and rectangular rooms on the bottom where the entryway is. And there's a square hearth in the middle of the main room. And all of the original houses were built to that same plan. So the plan had some significance. So sort of out of desperation, because I had no other ways to link this stuff, with the suggestion that someone had set out this series of megalithic shapes that corresponded to what the Dogon say are how matter forms, I double checked whether the Dogon who build stone houses. They live in the desert, and so they mostly build out of mud, but they do occasionally build a stone house, and when they build it to that same plan. They have the same round room, they have a square room in the center, same basic plan, down to specific details that when the house is built by laying flat stones without mortar, it's called drywall construction. And then at the top of the stone walls, they turn the stones upward, which they also do at the Skara Brae village. And there are other aspects of the clusters of houses at Skara Brae that very closely mimic what the Dogon do with their villages.
Wow.
So, well, the Dogon tell us they build to that plan for a reason. They're representing something. What they're representing is the body of a sleeping woman or a goddess. The round room is her head. The square room is her body cavity. The hearth in the center of the square room is her heart. The side rooms are her arms. The entryway rooms are her sexual parts.
That checks out. And
So
the ancient Vedic temples were also kind of structured in the same way to have the sacred architecture be deified and be built in the form of the god body. So when you go in, you have these different areas that hold the archetypal energies of that deity, so you can do proper worship and proper whatever practice that they were doing at that time. It's out of my realm of knowledge, but that seems to check out in ancient Vedic text as well.
it also carries forward into the first Christian structures. Even on Orkney, there's a bishop's house that's built to the same plan. If you go down to the Hebrides, you find structures that are built the same way.
Oh.
Down to cathedrals in Europe are built according to the same plan.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so once I had made that linkage and realized that the architecture is a match, it then became legitimate for me to examine everything that I saw in Orkney in terms of Dogon references, Dogon and Egyptian language and symbolism and cosmology. And so when you do that, you discover that place names on Orkney that have no firm etymology in the region make perfect sense when you express them in terms of either the Dogon language or the ancient Egyptian language. Like there's a site called Stenes on Orkney where there's reason to think that they were measuring out seasons of the year, among other things. There's a time aspect to it that's seasonal. Well, in the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic language, the word sten, S-T-E-N, means to distinguish between summer and winter. So you have that kind of intuitive linkage with names that that are very old on Orkney. As a matter of fact, it turns out worldwide that if you go back far enough in time, in one way or another, the ancient languages are the form of their word tells us what the word meant or was intended to mean. In the Dogon language, you have root concepts represented by syllables, and they build more complicated words by combining syllables where those root concepts, when you combine the root concepts, it defines the more complicated concept. So if I know how a Dogon word is pronounced, I can predict what it means. Now you can carry that to ancient Egypt. The same thing happens with the Egyptian hieroglyphs. And I'll give you a simple example. The ancient Egyptian word for the concept of a week, the Egyptians observed a 10-day week in ancient times. A lot of cultures did. Their word for week is written with two glyphs. The first glyph is a glyph that represents the concept of a day. It's a circle with a dot in the middle of it, the sun glyph. And the second glyph is the Egyptian number 10. And so looking at that word, that two glyph word, I realized that the glyphs of the word explained its own meaning to me. I didn't know that the Egyptians had a 10-day week until I explored that word. And then I figured out that every ancient Egyptian word worked that way. As a matter of fact, if you go to ancient China, to their earliest hieroglyphic writing, they had a 10-day week, and they formulated the word for week in that same way, with a sun glyph that was round with a dot in the middle of it, and their number 10. So we have direct comparability in the hieroglyphic languages of how they were formulated and used and interpreted between ancient China and ancient Egypt.
Wow, that's fascinating. One of the things that
At
stuck out to
500
me
feet,
with Scarab Brae was the name itself. Like it's almost like Scarab Ray or Scarab Ra. Is that
right?
a stretch?
It it it's a compelling resemblance, but it doesn't really hold up when you look into it. There's other symbolism that's harder to explain that about what it represents. But actually, there is a perspective from which it holds up that the word scarab could be related. The scarab, the dung beetle in Egypt, represents the concept of non-existence coming into existence, and the entire geography of
Numo.
Orkney is, how can I say, predicated on that concept.
Hmm.
The Dogon system gets very deep down into the fundamentals of how energy works. And one of the confusions for me early on was that the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic language defines two separate glyphs for the concept of time. I thought, why do they need two glyphs for time? Well, it turns out that energetically, we have two modes of time that are being represented. Just as we have two energies, we have magnetism that has certain attributes and modes of acting, and we have electricity that has different attributes and different modes of acting. It turns out that there are functions of time that associate with each of those two energies. One is an oscillation back and forth, that's magnetic, and the other is linear, that's electric. So Orkney Island is set up, all the major structures are set up at Stennes, which sits in view of an island called Hoy, where there are two elephant-like mountains. It looks like two sleeping elephants with a gap in between them. And anyone standing at Stennes can observe the motions of the sun during the year as it sets behind those mountains. To the extent that at the equinox, the sun sets squarely between the two mountains, and then you can watch it move progressively farther north to the winter solstice, and then back progressively farther south to the summer solstice. But a second mode of time is being reconciled by that same arrangement. The second mode of time, which is linear, is symbolized by the concept of sunrise to sunset. So on Orkney, you have the sun rising in the east, setting behind those mountains every day. But where it sets behind the mountains reconciles that oscillating offset of the second mode of energy of time. And so you have effectively a non-material mode of time and a material mode of time. Now that goes along with some fairly heavy scientific concepts. There's a concept called quantum coherence. Quantum coherence is one of the biologists that I read compares it to a jazz combo, where every player in a jazz combo has ultimate latitude to play whatever they want to play, but it has to be in keeping with the theme that the entire combo is playing. And so you have two structures that are being integrated in jazz. You have that individualized mode of musicianship, but reconciled with the group dynamic of musicianship. And that's what the two modes of time are doing. That we're reconciling a linear mode of time with an oscillating broad mode of time. And so it's as if every event that occurs is simultaneously being measured two ways. One way, it's being measured as if all events happen at once. It's an overview. And the other way, and the reason it's as if everything's happening at once is because that mode of time is ultra quick. The second mode of measure is linear, and it's as if every event happens sequentially.
Do you think that there's a significance to the structures that they were building, incorporating this knowledge of these different times of how the body moves and how the earth moves, and then how to maybe put that into like an ascension model for them? Was ascension a part of this culture's higher importance, and were these architectural pieces a part of that process?
Okay, the concept of ascension, which is a little complicated, is part of the system.
Yeah, yeah.
I can eventually get to explain what it represented and why it was important. Absolutely, the entire thrust of the system is to, well, the Dogen say there are two purposes in this instructional system, two main goals for the instruction. The first one was to help humanity understand our actual place in relation to the broader processes of creation, or broader processes of energy. And the second is to foster in us a facility for what they call discriminating knowledge. Now, discriminating knowledge is essentially the ability to draw an inference from a set of facts. Facts are very helpful and very useful, but inferences are a lot more powerful than a set of facts. It's when you can make the conceptual leap because of the facts that you actually have something. And so the entire esoteric tradition is based around, even ancient languages, based around forcing the person who's working with it to make certain inferences. When you read an Egyptian hieroglyphic word, you have to infer what the vowel sounds are. They didn't write them down. So the idea is to get us practice in arriving at that aha moment about, okay, I'll give you an example of the power of inference. We have two symbolic traditions that are a very close match for each other. The Dogen, which is given essentially in ancient Egyptian words, and we have the Buddhist symbolic tradition that ancient modern be glyphs that are used to write a word create a symbolic sentence, the same way that a rebus puzzle does. You know, child's rebus puzzle, you see a picture of an eye and you substitute the word eye. With an Egyptian hieroglyphic word, you see a picture of a symbol and you substitute a concept. And when you string those concepts together, you get a statement of intention on the part of the scribe who wrote the word about what he meant when he wrote the word. And so when you get into concepts that have many different aspects or complicated aspects, you end up with multiple versions or multiple spellings of the same word, each one dedicated to a different aspect of that concept. And so once you realize that, you don't have to guess what the words mean. At 500 BC, Confucius in China loudly complained because he could no longer count on Chinese words to do that. He saw it as a terrible loss to society that you could no longer look at a new Chinese word and infer from it what it meant.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. Um, what did you say? What Skara Brae meant? Did I miss that?
Actually, okay, let me give you a little background and then the meaning will make sense to you. the point where those two energies come together, where there's where, okay, we're dealing with a system called Samkhya in India, which is a companion to yoga. The Samkhya is the cosmological view of what yoga is a personalized view of, using the same terminology and the same concepts. Um, Samkhya says universes form in pairs, one less material and one more material. We basically have a cycle of energy flowing from one universe to the other, energy and mass. And so it's like the situation is like an hourglass, where if you start out with all the sand up in the top hourglass globe of the hourglass, and over time it filters down into the lower globe. That's what's happening with energy between these two domains. Okay, now at the midpoint of that energetic continuum between the non-material and the material domain, energy overturns.
Mm-hmm.
That magnetism holds primary sway in the non-material domain, and electricity holds sway in the material domain. And so there's an overturning of energy that happens there at the midpoint of that. And to convey the idea of something turning over, the system uses the image of a capsizing boat. So Orkney, which geographically signifies the point where those two energies come together. That's the concept of a sanctuary, is non-material and material energies coming together. Orkney is a physical representation of that point where the energies meet, the point at which the energies overturn. And the word Skara Brae in the Faroese language is based on roots. Actually, if you compare it to ancient Egyptian words, Skaher Bari means the overthrown boat, the overturned boat.
Mm.
The era of Skara Brae is around 3600 BC, which is the midpoint of the 12,000 year half cycle. It's the same approximate era that the Hebrew calendar was begun. That we're, I think, 5780 something in the Hebrew calendar right now. Approximately 6,000 years since it was established. So the era, both the era of Skara Brae and the geography of Skara Brae place it at the center point of this cycle of energy. Now, Einstein says that if we increase the mass of a thing, we also slow down its the pace of time that it experiences, and they've tested that with using atomic clocks to very refined amounts. They've determined that in the span of a millimeter difference in rise above the surface of the Earth, there's a change in the pace of time that happens. Minuscule one. If you increase the mass of a thing, you slow down its time frame. So at the same time that we're scrolling energy and mass between domains, we're also progressively slowing the pace of time. And that's why when astronomers, as they recently have done, announce that they see a mammoth galaxy out there way, way, way in the distance. The Webb telescope has just discovered a mammoth galaxy out there that formed way, way, way too quickly and actually came to an end way, way, way too quickly. They see galaxies out there that are 1,000 times as bright as they should be based on what theory says that they should be. And from my point of view, that's because the pace of time back then was running a lot quicker. It was less massive. The same amount of time that it took the universe to double in volume, the ratio of mass energy also doubled. There's a 1-to-1 correspondence between the expansion of space and that ratio of energy to mass.
Do you think there's a correlation between these ancient cultures, this knowledge of time and space, and the importance of our role here on Earth, and how to maybe play a part in that construction of these different galaxies? Is that also another stretch? Like, was this just an observation?
The how can I say this? The goals were simpler than that. I think the intention was that if we understood correctly where we stand in the relation to the larger processes of energy, that we'd be better equipped to make correct choices for ourselves and for the environments that we live in
Beautiful.
and so forth.
Beautiful.
Okay, so um, now the Dogen system rests. Oh, I was going to give you one more proof that time is slowing down. When the astronomers
Seems like
look
it's speeding
farther
up.
and farther, well, yeah, it feels like it's speeding up, but the pace. Okay, first let me explain to you why it slows down. Then I'll try to give you the proof of that it is. Okay, if you can imagine that you're an objective observer, you're standing outside the system, and you're able to measure how long it takes, what the objective duration of a moment is. You know exactly how long what that represents, and in that moment, because the speed of light is a constant, you know that light is going to be able to extend a certain distance. Now imagine that as you're sleeping, somebody came in and doubled the objective length of that moment.
Mhm.
The
Mhm.
consequence of that is that light would then be able to extend twice as far as it had before in the same moment, because the moment lasts twice as long objectively.
Wow.
And so by every mode of measure you have to judge by, it would look to you as if space had expanded when it actually hadn't. All that happened was that the pace of time had slowed down.
Invariably, being the what's the word I'm looking for? Not the observatory. Being the observer in that, you would have so many profound philosophical moments experiencing that, going out, getting your morning cup of coffee, going out to your observatory, looking out and seeing more space and just
Right.
constant profoundness. I mean, we hear that all the time with ancient cultures, that there may have been, and I know you wrote the Velikovsky heresy, and Velikovsky goes into this as well, talking about the different alignments of our galaxy, and how our planets were aligned, and how some of them may have been closer in the atmosphere, how, and
Right.
maybe possibly two moons, two suns, this kind of thing. So does that kind of play a role into what some of these cultures were trying to relay with, like, petroglyphs and architecture and things like that?
Yes, to my way of thinking of that, I mean, a lot of petrographs represent these same symbols in different forms. Now, the ancient Egyptians tried to warn us about this misperception. Okay, back in the day, it looked to everybody as if it was perfectly reasonable viewpoint to think that the sun orbited the Earth, because that's the way it looks. Intuitively, the sun goes around the Earth. That's what's happening. Anybody would tell you that's what's happening. But the more subtle view is that it's not. It just appears to be. So this idea that it's the pace of time that's slowing down, and it only makes it look to us, make it appear to us as if space is expanding when it really isn't, is something we have no way of getting our arms around. So in the Egyptian hieroglyphic language, they have a concept called mat, which is treated as a very, it's interpreted as a complicated concept that might mean truth, it might mean law, it might mean justice. It's a very complex concept of that nobody really grasps. Nobody can really express what it represents in ancient Egypt. It was the job of the pharaoh to uphold mat. But when you look at the glyphs of the word mat, what they say is perception is the foundation of measure. It's a caution to us. It's saying when you approach all this stuff thinking you're going to measure it and understand it, you need to understand that how you perceive the thing intimately affects how you measure it. That okay, now I was going to give you a proof that the pace of time has been slowing down. Scientists look out into the distance with their telescopes into the universe, and the further out they go, the quicker a rate of expansion they measure. And so what they've concluded from that is that the pace of expansion of the universe is speeding up, and they're postulating there must be dark energy, some energy we don't know about, that is capable of universally pushing the universe in all directions and expanding it faster and faster and faster and faster. The Dogen system is saying, no, that's completely wrong. What you're seeing is the effect of your own progressively slowing pace of time. It makes it look as if events that happened ultra quickly a long time ago, way, way far out there, makes it look as if things are expanding faster. But in fact, all that's happening is your point of view is slowing. It's like a passenger riding on a train on the tracks, and there's a second train on the next track over, and one of the trains changes speed. It might not be immediately apparent to the passenger on the first train whether it was his train that changed speed or the other train that changed speeds, and which one slowed up, which slowed down, which one sped up. When you're looking at things relatively, it's hard to tell. So there are all sorts of indicators. I've sort of been collecting a list of indicators that uphold the idea that the pace of time has been progressively slowing down. In fact, in the system of energy the Dogen are talking about, the pace of time is one of the few factors that's actually changing, legitimately changing. There are others that seem to be changing. Okay, so now the Dogen system rests on concepts of parallelism and opposites. But when you get down to the root of it, what they're trying to get us to understand is a handful of dynamics of energy that hold true on whatever scale you want to look at it. And they hold a cluster of dynamics of energy that are responsible for the formation of matter, are also responsible for the formation of a biological cell and for the formation of consciousness. You have the potential for consciousness built into the dynamics of the energy, just as you have an oscillation of time built right into the two energies. So the perspective is that this energy goes through a cycle that the Dogen are comparing to the natural water cycle. When you start studying this stuff, you find all of these, what seem like very apt, quaint metaphors that are being used. The idea of a sleeping goddess at the surface of the waters who opens her eyes to see the light. A very poetic, apt, intuitive metaphor. The further on with the study you go, you realize that these are not metaphors. They're telling us in plain language what's actually happening. These are objective descriptions of what's actually going on. And so when they describe the energy cycle and compare it to the natural water cycle, that's ultimately not a metaphor. It's an objective statement that the dynamics of energy are the dynamics of water, all the way down to the bottom. And the stages that energy goes through are the very same stages that energy goes through, or that water goes through. For example, Hawking energy, which is energy that is leaked out of black holes, the scientists say that it's evaporated from the black hole. That's a water cycle term, and it creates something called instanton knots, which have also been documented to be naturally occurring in bodies of water. These instanton knots are sort of a pre-materialized energy. They're the equivalent of water vapor in the natural water cycle.
Do they hold a special property but at all that you know of?
Well, yes. Hinduism describes the state of instanton knots as, they use the term omkara. It's a pre-materialized state of energy that is inherently trifold in nature. And scientists tell us that at the center of these instanton knots are three monopoles. The Dogen system, the materializing. Okay, you have two different halves to this cycle. In the materializing half cycle, things begin as sort of in a superconductive state where magnetism is dormant and electricity is unresisted. And then periodically, there are events that could happen either randomly or from the outside that um, interrupt the circuit of electrical energy in that superconductive state. And with that interruption, a spark is created. The spark is a monopole of electricity. And that spark evokes two monopoles of magnetism, and now we have three monopoles. What we essentially have, the two monopoles of magnetism are the equivalent or a precursor to a proton, and the spark of electricity is the equivalent or a precursor to an electron. So essentially, we have energy emerging in proton-electron pairs. And a
Is this a trident?
proton-electron pair is inherently unstable, that it will, after a period of time, the electron will separate from the proton, if it's just a standalone pair, and move away from it. In most cases, it'll end up orbiting the proton and create a hydrogen atom.
Hmm. Is this a trident or the Vajra?
Yeah, well, the Vajra is the equivalent of a Dogen symbol called the Kanaga, which is sort of a squared version of the rounded Hindu Vajra. But what that's representing is a complicated concept. I'd said there's parallelism in the system, but we're all aware of three linear dimensions. What we're not immediately aware of is three energetic counterparts to those dimensions, that the energy itself expresses itself dimensionally. There's a dimensional separation between electricity and magnetism at root.
And the
That
mercurial solution
one of the
between,
signatures of that. What's that?
and the mercurial solution that kind of bonds them together.
Well, that's more complicated, but we know because, okay, there's certain signatures to dimensionality. For one thing, the structures emerge geometrically. You go linear dimensionality, you go from a geometric point, which in the traditional view has no dimensionality, to a line which is defined by 2 points, that's one dimensional, to an area which has 4 points, which is two dimensional, to a volume that is three dimensional. Well, on the energetic side, you have electricity, which emerges as a point charge, that's a geometric point. You have magnetism that emerges as two monopoles, so that's the equivalent of a geometric line. And you have a precursor state with the instanton knots that is defined by three monopoles. And so on the energetic side, you have a descending series of what I call energetic dimensions that interface at the middle with the linear dimensions. And that's what the Vajra represents, and that's what the Kanaga represents. The concept of these two sets of dimensionality linking together.
Do you think there is a possibility, yet again, another stretch? Because I like throwing the cast in the net sometimes. But do you think there's a possibility to?
Yeah, that's a great place to start with any interpretation, by the way, is with the resemblances.
Yes,
So go
yeah,
ahead.
I agree. I agree, and you do such a beautiful job of that. I mean, your work is vast. I mean, you cover. I don't see any books specifically on like the Bhagavad Gita or like the ancient Vedics, but you seem to have a pretty good grasp on the Hindu cosmologies. Do you have a book on the Hindu cosmology, or are you working on a one of those
There are
books?
elements of it that come up in various books. I'm about to self-publish a book called The Waters of Life, where Hindu concepts play a larger role, and where the perspectives of the go-to guy for Hindu symbolism is René Guénon, a Frenchman who wrote in the early 20th century.
Okay, so that's
He's
yes.
the
Sorry, go
go-to
ahead.
source for my go-to Buddha. Adrian Snodgrass is my go-to source for Buddhist symbolism, and his go-to source for a lot of his symbolism is Guénon.
Okay, so that kind of brings me into the question that I was originally going to ask here. So the water, obviously, the primordial waters play a huge role in this, and so
Right.
is there a common theme across our ancient ancestors and these very beautiful, mystic, magical cultures that might have been like inflicting specific energies into water, or maybe putting a charge into water to thus have transcendental experiences. So, you know, we know that the ancient Greeks created like the water organ, and they were working with putting harmonies into water to change the structure of the water itself. And then baths are very important. Do you think that the the qualities of our electrical body and our time body, and working with the atmosphere and those different time dimensions, and working with the dimensional portal of water itself, and then putting these, was this one of the practices of the ancients? Does that question make any sense there?
It does, and I'll try to explain it in terms of what's going to be in the upcoming book I'm about
Nice.
to publish. Any body of water is actually a two-state body. They had a very hard time proving it and documenting it, detecting it, because the transition between the two states is continuous and it's ultra quick, so quick that it's very hard to measure. But every body of water oscillates between a chaotic state and a coherent state. And the dynamics of that oscillation are exactly what the Dogon are saying, and in India they're saying are the dynamics between the two universes. It's exactly the same oscillation.
Also plays a part into the female deities, right, and how they always represent chaos and order.
Right, that's
Ooh.
right. It's the same symbolism. Now, in any living organism, okay, let's back up a little bit. Let's go back to that superconductive domain where energy first, materializing energy first emerges. Okay, from the Dogon perspective, what creates superconductivity is the perfect alignment of all the little magnets in the domain. If you align them one way, it's called superconductive. It's where magnetism is dormant and electricity is unresisted. But if you flip all the magnets over, then you create a state called superinsulation where the reverse is true, that magnetism is unresisted and electricity is dormant.
Wow.
And the continuum of energy that oscillates in the universe is a transition from one state to one of those states to the other of those states. And all you're really doing is you're playing a mahjong game where all the tiles are face down and now you're turning them all face up. Now, the reason that happens is because when that little spark of energy is created, when you disrupt the circuit of electricity in the superconductive domain, and you produce the two magnetic poles, that same impulse of energy causes, okay, the magnets appear on either side of the electrical monopole. But that same input of energy causes the magnet to flip. Well, we know that parallel magnetism, when all the poles of the magnets are aligned the same way, pulls together. Anti-parallel magnetism pushes apart. So when this little magnet flips over with the electrical charge in between, now suddenly they're set anti-parallel to the rest of the domain, so they start to get pushed out by anti-parallel magnetism. And as they move, they open up a dimensional space that allows the electrical charge to extend. The Dogon are saying that's what happened with our sun and the Sirius stars. They say the two Sirius stars and our sun all emerged together just exactly like that. And that over time, our sun has moved progressively farther and farther and farther away from the Sirius stars as a consequence of what is essentially parallel magnetism. And so our sun is orbiting the Sirius stars in exactly the same way that an electron is orbiting a proton in the hydrogen atom. It's the same dynamic, just played out on a higher scale.
Wow.
Now, that anti-parallel magnetism is a very important concept. The effects of what happens if the magnetism is parallel or not has a huge influence on what happens to energy and to biology, but nobody ever considers it. So the biologists I've been reading are saying that just in any living organism, just inside the aqueous membranes, an exclusion zone forms of coherent water in its coherent state. And most components are excluded from that zone that's microns wide next to the aqueous membrane. They're not sure how that exclusion zone forms, but it creates a circumstance that is essentially superconductive. And so what exists inside of any living creature is this secondary conduit for energy, secondary to the nervous system of the animal, that they've measured impulses getting back to the brain half a second quicker than through the nervous system. It explains why a creature like a hydra can be a living creature when it has no nervous system. Now, the way that exclusion zone forms is clear to me because of the way the Dogen explained the dynamics. There are signatures to certain types of transactions, that the signature of materializing energy is an increase in magnetism. The signature of deconstructing energy is residual ions, positive and negative ions. So one of the features of these exclusion zones is the aqueous membrane that it's next to has negative ions on one side of the membrane and positive ions on the other side of the membrane. That says to me we're talking about a deconstructing process. And the exclusion zones only form with aqueous membranes. They don't form with non-aqueous membranes, which means the water that's in the membrane is critical to the process. So based on the Dogen energetics, what's happening is infrared light, which will penetrate into the tissues of a person or a creature, is also readily absorbed by a water molecule. And Japanese scientists have done studies that show that under the right circumstances, infrared light at the right frequencies of infrared is not only absorbed by the water molecule, but it also deconstructs it. So we have infrared light penetrating the membrane, deconstructing the water molecule. At the time it deconstructs it, it also flips the molecule components, which sets them anti-parallel to the rest of the membrane and the rest of the biology of the creature. And now those migrate out to just beyond the edge of the membrane with the signature ions on either side of the membrane, and the anti-parallel magnetism pushes everything away.
Wow.
So it's the very same dynamics that are producing matter that are producing this very critical function of biology. The biologists can't understand how the membrane of the cell works. At first, they thought cell membranes were impermeable, but then they discovered that there were certain elements that were able to cross the boundary one way or the other. And so they said, well, clearly there are little gateways in the cell membrane that are of a certain size that will allow a molecule of a certain size to get through, but of a larger size not to. But the problem is now over time, they've discovered there are all sorts of things that pass one way or the other of all sorts of different sizes. They can't conceptualize a gateway structure that would accommodate that. But they're not considering it.
This is a little maybe off topic, but on topic. I kind of think of the world or the universe in the macro and the micro of cellular structure of atoms and whatnot, and the solar system represents that same structure. So with you're saying with this primordial water existing in the cell and then the split out to the sides, does that mean we exist on the inside of the planet rather than on the crust outside?
There are similar energetic effects that happen on the planet, but it's not exactly. You actually do have the same effects at the surface of water that you have in those exclusion zones. So yes, if you talk about the surface of ocean water, you're seeing the same effect that we have biologically in an organism. Now with the cell, if instead we imagine what's going on is that certain chemical reactions within the cell cause the molecule to flip, The ones that flip get pushed out of the organism by parallel magnetism. It doesn't. You don't need a membrane to accomplish that. They're being pushed out. It doesn't matter the size of the molecule. All that matters is how is it oriented. And the same thing with the components that pass through the other direction. If they're oriented the right way magnetically, they get passed through.
So would that have to do with density being passed through because of the density? And would that mean that we are connected by that silver cord to the nucleus of the cell?
It means that as
That to be
they've
like gravity?
discovered that the membrane of the cell is really not significant. That they've discovered if they pierce the membrane of a cell, that the cell holds its coherency for quite a long period of time, and they don't know why. But we know that parallel magnetism pulls together. So if all the magnetism in that cell is aligned the same way, it's going to hold its coherency for a period of time.
I was going to ask about cryogenic freezing. Do you believe that that's a thing with the cells, like being able to freeze cells and be able to thaw them out later and have it actually be a working model?
Yeah, we know
Kinda
that
random,
works
sorry.
because they can do it with a woman's egg. They can freeze her eggs, and decades later, we've seen eggs unfrozen and then produce.
There you go.
We've seen frozen DNA in the Antarctic that, when it thaws, is still perfectly viable DNA.
It seems like when you go to space, you know, you have those sub-freezing temperatures out there, and you know, the preservation of like the no oxygen and everything. So it seems like the bacteria could be able to float around until it reaches a livable atmosphere to where it would breach and kind of. That was super random. I apologize for kind of going off the cuff there. I just thought I've always been super curious about cryogenic freezing.
No, that's a good point, because there are certain bacteria they know can do that. There's certain bacteria that will form clusters that enable them to do that. But you also have certain creatures that can withstand all sorts of trauma in space and in volcanoes and other
heavy pressure.
So there's a lot of
Underwater, deep
sci-fi kind of topics that bring up this really cool concept of like bacteria technology, or like cellular technology, where like the wires are made of like fleshy like substance where electricity is able to flow through, as opposed to like you know, like our concept of wires and rubber and do you think that is an this is another weird random side tangent, but do you think that is an actual thing, that to be able to create technology out of like bacteria, like conductive material out of like a bacterial source?
I mean, it could be. We know that DNA is an excellent data storage medium, for example. So I don't see why other living tissues might not be. They might not find uses for them that apply to electricity or energy or storage of data.
Wow.
Okay, now biologically, there's another issue with organisms. One of the big questions biologically is, how is it that a cell has instant access to the energetic components it needs for the reactions it's going to produce? Anywhere in the cell on a moment's notice. How does it get it?
Yes.
And they try to come up with all of these complicated transfer methods. Here's how you move an electron from component to component, from atom to atom, basically, trying to figure out how that happens. These exclusion zones, though, are superconductive zones. And we know from the matter descriptions the Dogen give us that a superconductive zone is like a gigantic reservoir for a proton-electron pair. So that means anywhere in the entire body, because like 70% of the water in an organism is within microns of an aqueous membrane. Anywhere in the body, the organism has access to a sort of an endless reservoir of proton-electron pairs that it can produce instantaneously.
That is mind blowing. So we're talking about Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, is there
What were you going to ask?
a uh, m- we were talking earlier about magnets and water and their the different polar differences of superconductor, super insulator, and a little bit about baths. Is there a magnetic bath that you've heard of? Like, because we know about shock therapy and or putting electricity or magnets in and around the body can actually have like some heightened experiences, heightened conscious experiences. Have you heard of any sort of magnetic baths that might do the same thing?
No, I know, I've heard of researchers who work with magnets to try to produce health effects, but I haven't studied it very deeply. Um, it makes sense to me that if it also makes sense to me that infrared light um, potentially has beneficial effects for. Apparently, infrared light is critical to the repair of injuries and things like that in the human body. That there's signals being sent out after an injury that that call some of these components to the site to try to fix it. But I haven't studied that deeply enough to know how it works or to have an opinion about it.
Well, your grasp on
Um,
physics is incredible. I mean, we were starting the
yeah.
conversation with history and ancient ancestral tribes, and then now we're on a deep physics kick, and I love it. I absolutely love it. Um,
That's
Well,
fascinating.
the physics is very simple. I mean, there's one message that's trying to be communicated anciently. It's that, folks, this isn't rocket science.
hmm
That this is a matter of looking at the thing the right way. It's not a matter of it being so complicated you can't grasp it.
Observation.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And that even um, Michio Kaku says that um, below a certain level of measure in the quantum domain, we no longer have the ability to measure accurately. So you're not going to come to the answers of things through measure, through progressively more refined measure. You're going to arrive at it by conceptualizing what has to be happening and then demonstrating that that's what really happens. And that's what the Dogen want us to do. They want us to understand how the dynamic works. It's a very simple dynamic. Once you understand it at any level, you can apply it at all the levels. It's a single set of dynamics of energy, and they're pretty straightforward. My book, and the Spark of the Universe, is where I arrive at what those dynamics are. Um, Now we have a scientific perspective on what that dynamic of energy actually is, also that agrees with what the Dogon and the Egyptians are saying. The symbol that the Dogon or the Egyptians used to represent the continuum of energy in the universe is the almond-shaped Egyptian mouth glyph. Um, it's very small at one end and larger in the middle. It's an almond shape. It's a Vesica Pisces shape.
Mm.
Um, I had been for the current book I'm about to publish. I had been exploring information about a hydrogen atom because I knew that was key to understanding a bunch of this stuff. And I thought that I had my arms around all the important material. And then one day a friend messaged me with a picture of a crop circle that had just formed in England. And the crop circle I could see had the contours of a water molecule that was configured like a water molecule, but at the center of the crop circle were three almond shapes that I didn't understand what they represented. And so I did some digging and discovered that there's a very subtle but important aspect of any molecule called the resonant states of the molecule. So pursuing that, I discovered that back in the 1920s, a French aristocrat and physicist by the name of Louis de Broglie wrote a highly important paper about the resonance states of a hydrogen atom. He used math to determine that the orbital levels of an electron in a hydrogen atom, there are certain levels that the electron can move to depending on the energy state, that the places, the resting states where the electrons sit correspond mathematically to the resonance points of the energy. This is a resonance issue.
Mm.
So he did a bunch of other study, and he measured um, what he calls the cyclical influence of magnetism on an electron orbiting uh, hydrogen atom, and the cyclical presence of magnetism on the components of the proton of that same atom. And he graphed them. And the graphs for the electron, the graph is that same almond-shaped Vesica Pisces shape. And for the proton, it's the zigzag wave, single wave glyph shape of the Egyptian language. So I thought, this is way too important to have been ignored by the Egyptian hieroglyphic language. Let's find a word that's written with those two glyphs. And I discovered what it represents is, it represents what Wallace Budge calls the divine name. It represents the hidden aspect of creational energy or of deity. There's also another word that's written with the two glyphs that's followed by the image of a kneeling mother holding up her newborn infant in front of her and them looking at each other, regarding each other. Symbolically, what it says is perceives the mother. Well, the mother, the feminine energy is magnetism. And so I took that as sort of a congratulatory message saying, if you understand the significance of these two glyphs of the leading glyphs of the word, you perceive what the concept energetically is of the mother. Yeah. So those energetics on a universal scale, what the Dogons and Egyptians are saying happens is that at all the resonance points, which occur in factors of, okay, we have energy that's creating this almond shape, moving from a superconductive state to a superinsulating state. And along the way, we're creating resistance and mass that slows down the pace of time. Now, every time, at every point where time flows 10 times slower than it did before, we have a resonance point. And so what you have happening is the definition of zones, energetic zones within this continuum of energy, 14 of them, that compare to biological zones that naturally emerge in deep sea water. You know, that if you go down into the Marianas Trench area, that there are creatures that live on the bottom that depend on that prefer a whole different, the factors that control whether a creature lives on the bottom or at some other level in this deep sea water are how much sunlight does it like, how much water pressure can it stand, what temperature of water does it like, and so forth. So the Dogon and Egyptians are saying that we have these 14 zones of energy that naturally differentiate over the continuum of energy. And those correspond to states of consciousness in Hinduism. Hinduism says we have levels of consciousness, and that human consciousness is sort of the tip of the iceberg that sticks above the water, the surface of the water. But that the rest of the iceberg below it, there's a whole other aspects to consciousness that we aren't aware of. The idea is it doesn't matter which of these 14 stages of the continuum you sit at. If you look backwards towards the previous domains, 3 or 4 levels, it's going to look like waves to you because the pace of time is so quick that you speed up the pace of anything, it looks like waves. Imagine headlights on the highway of automobiles at night. If you took a video of that and then speeded it up, it would reach a point where you didn't see individual headlights anymore. You saw streaks of light, saw waves.
Yes. This gets into an interesting thing I heard you talk about with the Tuatha De Danann and the predecessors, I think you said, called the Numo, and what,
Right.
or Numa, and what
Right.
Numa means. Yeah, because we
Well,
understand here that the Tuatha De Danann also are the group of people that exist in the higher vibration and lower vibration at the same time. That's why they have this etheric state. So yeah, if you could kind of get into that a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we have the potential for consciousness built into the relationship between magnetism and electricity. Time is the natural oscillation between those two energies. The speed of light is a ratio between those two energies, that it remains constant no matter what the wavelength is. But the potential for consciousness is built into that same dynamic. As I said, the idea is consciousness is quantum coherent, that we have the ability to examine a thing in overview, or we have the ability to break it down sequentially. We can't do both at the same time. It's quantum coherence. I say consciousness comes about because we have the ability to reconcile a point of view that is overview, which is magnetic, with a point of view that is linear, which is electrical. Now, Hinduism says that at each of those stages along the way, there's a potential for consciousness. So at the quickest speed of light, speed of time, and the most root domain of energy, there's any number of ancient cultures that recognize the existence of a primordial consciousness that they don't deify. It's consciousness in many of the same ways that we have consciousness. It's all the same stuff. Buddhism says, esoteric Buddhism says, the final state of ascension is, or of enlightenment is, understanding that it's all one consciousness. So the Dogons say that primordial consciousness makes routine attempts to keep track of what's going on, and to track things and to interact with things. And it does this by sending out three categories of orbs of energy that the Egyptians call Aku, the Dogon call them Ogo, but they compared to those three monopoles I was talking about that emerge in the superconductive domain, the three categories of orb-like energy that are, well, the Dogon word for those orbs, one of the words for it is Tityeni, and traditionally the word Tityeni is translated as messengers, but I've said that every Dogon word tells us its own meaning. If you examine that word in terms of its component syllables, it literally means to send, to say hello. That occasionally you get a glimpse through a word like that of what the nature is of that primordial intelligence. It's a feminine intelligence. And every little glimpse I've gotten of it betrays it as just the sweetest, most generous personality you can think of. That the idea that these orbs that communicate information back and forth between levels of consciousness are defined as to send, to say hello. It's just that's a revelation to me. It's very, very, very compelling reflection of what the nature of that personality must be. So there was a man named John Burke who passed away in recent decades, but he did a lot of exploration of ancient stone structures like pyramids and stone cairns and stone circles and so forth, and the effects that those structures have energetically on unplanted seeds of agriculture. That he was able to demonstrate that even to this day in some cultures, farmers will bring containers of their seeds to the top of a pyramid or mound site or to the interior of a cairn site and leave the seeds there for a period of time. And then Burke documented how much more productive the seed was that had been treated that way as compared to seed that was kept separate. Now, as he did his studies, he was taking photographic records of all these sites he was visiting, and in the interior of some of these cairns, what would turn up on the photograph he had taken was a picture of one or more of these orbs. A physicist who was with him explained to him that these orbs of energy exist just below a frequency where we can see them, but that the flash of the camera added just enough extra energy to the orb to temporarily make it visible, and then it fell back.
Oh.
It wasn't visible again.
That's
So
fascinating.
Burke actually caught the orbs there. Egyptian words that are the names of these orbs are define the orbs as being responsible for the fertility of plants.
Wow.
Um,
Okay. Sorry. Keep going. I'm sorry. So fascinating.
and the Dogon words for the same orbs, in other words, the Egyptian word is aku, comparable Dogon word is ogo, which is a term for an orb of light. And the Dogon see one class of these orbs of light as being responsible for the fertility of plants. But there's another class of those orbs. Now these orbs are intelligence, little discrete intelligences. The Dogon are saying that it's one class of these orbs that during the middle of the energetic cycle were able to take material form and became the teachers of the Dogon. I'll try to explain how that works. The differences in time frame. Okay, we have energy scrolling from one domain to another domain, and not just energy but also mass. And as the mass increases in one domain, the time frame slows down. As it decreases in the other domain, time frame speeds up. So just like an hourglass, you have a point in the cycle where you have the same amount of sand in the top globe that you have in the bottom globe. The time frames equalize. This compares to the idea of water pressure equalizing. Scientists who are in a submarine will use an airlock to equalize the air pressure between the inside of the airlock and the outside water so they can move safely between the two. Same thing in space. The implication is that the midpoint in the energetic cycle, when the time frames have equalized, crossover between our domain and the one immediately next to us becomes possible. And that's what the Dogons say their teachers did at around 3600 BC.
Wow. These lights
The
too.
the Dogon word. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh,
Laird.
let's just say the lights too. They associate to fairy lore, right? Or the lore of
Yes.
the Tuatha De Danann. Do you think there's correlation between that that similarity?
I think there absolutely is. I mean, the further back you read accounts of fairies, the more overt they were. I have accounts written in the 1600s saying, of course, our grandparents had many more and much easier encounters with these energetic fairies than we do now. They had more frequent and more substantial encounters. That there's also time dilation effects associated with the fairies.
Mm-hmm.
The story of Rip Van Winkle, who fell asleep, was taken away by the fairies, and then brought back and discovered that all of his friends and relatives were dead. He had been gone for a number of years, but when he came back, it had been decades here. That was written by trying to think of who wrote Rip Van Winkle. His father was from Orkney, and Orkney has all sorts of history about ancient sites, about beings that reside inside some of the 400 stone cairn ancient sites that are on the island.
That's so many for that island. That do you know through your studies have you found much of like magnetic radiation, or is there a heightened Geiger count on that island? Like there must be something very special, or what are the geological constituents of the island?
Well, okay, if you study the geometry of superconductivity, it's precisely the geometry of a mound site in England with a trench around it.
Really?
And they've done magnetic studies on Orkney of the Maze Howe site, which is one of those, and discovered heightened magnetic effects down in the trench.
Wow.
But it's quite possible, to my way of that someone was replicating superconductive conditions in the mound the way they configured the site. There are other aspects on at Stennis that argue very compellingly that they were using energy to do very interesting things.
That
May
is
have actually created
fascinating.
an exclusion zone for energy in the locks around the isthmus where Stennis is.
There you have it.
Yeah, yeah, I heard you talk about that word pneumo. I wanted to, or pneuma, if you could get into that a little bit, because I think that has a interesting meaning,
Right.
which
Dogen
you would
described
think like they wouldn't. Yeah, go
their
ahead.
teachers as that they used the word pneumo, but that compares to an Egyptian phrase. It's a compound word, nu ma. Nu means waves, and ma means to perceive. So the very name of the word of the name of their teachers is waves perceive, which is what they say happened. That an energetic consciousness took material form. The Dogen say that they're okay. Let's back up a little bit. Another Egyptian word, nema. Okay, the vowel sounds in the Egyptian hieroglyphic language are uncertain because they didn't write them. We have to guess what the vowel sounds were. So there's an Egyptian word, nema, that means pygmy. That could reasonably also have been pneumo, not nema. But the earliest Scandinavian accounts of Orkney report two groups living side by side on the island at the time, a group of short-statured pygmies of very strange habits, and a group of average-sized clerics so different from the Scandinavians as to constitute a different race. John Hedges, who was a lifelong Orcadian, he was native from Orkney, and he was also an archaeologist as a profession and helped um, preserve the Tomb of the Eagle site in Isbister on Orkney, and wrote a book about it. He opens the book by saying, people who are familiar with Orkney may find it hard to accept that Neolithic Orkney more resembled modern Africa than it does Scandinavia.
Hmm. That's
So
so cool.
they've done DNA studies on Orkney that show that 1% of modern Orcadian men share a Y haplogroup in their DNA with the Egyptians and the Dogon.
What about China and the people of the East and their
Okay, in
genetics?
China, there is the Chinese language rests on an earlier hieroglyphic language called the Dangba language, which was developed or brought to China by the Naki or Naxi. Um, the Naki are understood to have been Black African, to the point that the word Na took on the meaning of black in China. The hieroglyph that the Naki used to represent themselves is a stick figure that's blackened in.
Wow.
Now, in cultures, okay, the Dogon perspective is that there were dangers in being too closely associated with these teachers. They compare to what's described in the Old Testament, the cautions that were given to the Israelites to stay back from Moses's mountain because of the bad effects that might accrue to them because of the energetics there. So the Dogons say that their teachers were concerned about the bad effects of their presence on us. And so to limit that, they decided to educate 8 tribes people from any given culture at a remote location, which I take to be Orkney, and then send those 8 people back to where they came from to pass the civilizing skills on to everybody else. That's one of Jung's archetypes, the 8 quasi-mythical ancestors or emperors or gods, or they're represented in various different ways, who were the bringers of civilizing skills.
Can we talk about that a little bit? Because there's a huge burst online of a bunch of talk that the ancient cedar races were, big stature, blonde or red hair, blue eyes, and that type of genetic. Do you think it varied? And if so, what are these 8 different cedar archetypes physically? I
Well,
guess.
academic researchers I study say that they don't know of an ancient culture that doesn't represent that they had help or gifted knowledge from somebody more capable than themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And the suggestion, there are all sorts of different descriptions in terms of size and attributes and so forth for these. So just because the instructors of the Dogon and the Buddhist tradition that tie to these archetypes um, seems to link to energetic beings that were able to materialize, doesn't preclude the idea that there were also visitors from other places that were more traditionally sci-fi alien.
Mm-hmm.
So,
It's a big one.
I mean, I know a physicist who should know who says there are dozens of different alien types that we've interacted with, our government has interacted with, that have been here
Yeah,
for millennia,
that's a
and
common
some of
common
them
thing
are
too.
very
Yeah,
friendly, and some of them you wouldn't want to meet.
yeah,
Right.
yeah. We've definitely talked to
So, I
experiencers
think
on
that
the
it's
show
quite
of
possible
shared that as well.
So it's quite possible we had many different types, and it doesn't boil down to, oh, they were just giants, or they were just pygmies, or they were just reptilians, or they were just whatever.
It's kind of crazy to see that, we like if modern culture is so dichotomous, and it's like we want to be diverse, we need this, but we're also running into like a make everything singular. We want to accept diversity, and we want to create and allow this individualistic lifestyle for people. But then again, when you really step back and look at it, it's kind of making everything more singular on a cultural level. When then you start to look back at our ancient ancestors and our ancient history, when it was so incredibly diverse, and then even these different types of archetypes that you're explaining here, small people, and like in the Norse mythos, right, in the different branches of the Yggdrasil tree, there's all these different creatures that have all these beautiful, amazing qualities about them that make life
Right.
all of life, and it makes the diverse goodness of everything, the plethoric amount of reality. And so it's just that funny dichotomous uh style and way that in which we are living in our modern reality.
It's the same jazz combo I was talking about, the same quantum coherence, the idea of maximum individual freedom for each player to play what they want, or to be the way they are, or to express themselves the way they want, but in the context of a harmonious whole. And so, to my way of thinking,
Harmonious
that's what
whole.
we're trying to get at. That's the ideal situation, is the diversity makes that richer, but it only makes it richer if it's harmonious.
um, yeah, when you were
Beautiful.
talking about the pygmies in Skara Brae, do you know Susan B. Martinez? Have you heard of her?
I know the name, and I've seen some of the work, but I don't know her personally.
Yeah, she talks a lot about how there's little people everywhere, and they were very highly spiritual people, and that people, uh
Yes.
kings and whatnot, used to go to these people for kind of knowledge of what was happening or going on. They're like the little cherubim, basically, but they lived all over the place. And it's interesting that Skara Brae has, I guess they found at the sites smaller beds or whatnot that these pygmy people lived in and had this area. How is it? Do you think it was possible for them? Was it the little people that built Skara Brae, or was it somebody else that built Skara Brae? Was it just the information that built Skara Brae? Like, how did this structure? How did this get
The,
built?
the Dogons say that humanity patterned their earliest living structures after what their teachers did. So there are parallels between the Skara Brae house structures and the stone cairns that exist on Orkney. It's very believable to me that a group of students being taught civilizing skills, including architecture and construction, put up a set of houses that were patterned after the stone cairns.
Are you in the wheelhouse of the stone cairns being naturally created, or they were cast stones specifically created with like constituents for magnetic properties? Or what's your take on the cairns and how they were built and their function?
It depends on the era and the cairn, because this is a complicated subject. The ancient Egyptians describe a kind of gateway between domains called an akhed. It's a light shrine. And I see parallels between some of the stone cairns and those akheds. The earliest form of a Buddhist stupa is an evoked hillside that separated earth and sky, but that has very many of the same attributes as some of the stone cairns around the world. Energetically, I can see a perspective from which some of them may have been evoked as gateways from another energy domain. That
like the orbs you were describing earlier.
It's hard to explain how that happens, but that there are effects of energy that when you're working with the right materials, you're working with chalk or you're working with iron-rich clay in the right context, that you might be able to evoke a structure like a stone cairn, essentially 3D print a structure from the other side of the other side of the barrier of the domain.
Whoa!
As a kind of gateway to cross
to speak through these different these conscious communications with the other side and ask them for a cairn to be brought to you as like a communication device of sorts.
No, I would say that it was initiated by the other side. Okay, here's what our essential motive and problem is. In this cycle of energy that happens, it compares to a sleep cycle at various levels. What's happening on one side is, okay, we're talking about yuga cycle stuff. Just a minute. Isaac, wait 1 minute here. I need to stop here for a second.
Okay.
You can pause it.
Okay. We have sleep cycle stuff going on. Okay, at the end, at the least material state, on the non-material side, the energetic side, you have a state of consciousness that compares to REM sleep in a sleep cycle. It's a state where of perfect consciousness, but where the consciousness is not able to take action. Our bodies inhibit action to prevent us from acting out the things we're dreaming in REM state.
Yeah.
The problem is, okay, that also compares to a medical condition called locked-in syndrome. There's a famous book and film called The Diving Bell and the Butterfly about a Frenchman who suffered a stroke at the wheel of a car, had a car accident, and was taken home as brain dead to be cared for. There was, as far as they knew, there was no brain activity, and his body was still functioning, but he wasn't cognizant as far as they knew. All he could do was blink his eyelids. And so after a few months, one of his caretakers realized that he actually was still in there. He was still perfectly conscious in there. And that they arranged a system between the two of them for him to blink and indicate one letter at a time. She'd step through the alphabet and he'd blink at the letter he wanted to indicate. And he ended up writing this whole book eventually, one letter at a time with this aid. He was perfectly conscious, he couldn't move it. It's the equivalent of being buried alive. So the nature of the Yuga cycle is such that for a period of thousands and thousands of years, at the end of the cycle, the less material side is going to be in the equivalent of a locked-in syndrome state. If you don't have a compatriot who knows you're in there, then it is the equivalent of being buried alive. It's completely horrific. So, we have a problem here. We have a situation where about a third of the way into the cycle, the universe that is in the non-material state realizes that it's headed toward a locked-in syndrome situation, and it finds itself in desperate need of a compatriot. But at that same extreme of the cycle, the material side of the equation is furthest removed from any awareness of the non-material side at all. So just at the point non-materiality needs a caretaker, the beings on the other side of the equation are going to have no idea that it's there. So they decide to take action. They move to the material side and try to establish a framework for society that will preserve the memory of the fact that non-materiality is there. And they arrange a mode of instruction that sort of filters out, it's almost like an interview process. Initiation is like an interview process to filter out those people who are most capable of communicating in the mode that non-materiality needs.
Wow.
Now, it's an ongoing cycle, which means that the side that's more material today, 12,000 years from now, will be the side that's less material. So it's a mutual need. It's a mutual motive. It's the covenant between the two universes is, look, we're going to each do this for the other as we go along. At a certain point, we're going to step in and make sure that the structures exist so that the non-material side, when it's in this locked-in state, will have a caretaker that it can communicate with. Samkhya says there are routine attempts from non-materiality to induce action or to communicate knowledge to the material side. Vivid dreams, clairvoyancy, the unusual behavior of animals, shamans who can access non-material things using drugs, many different methods of communicating.
Wow.
So that's really the underlying motive for why would anybody bother to do this? Why would anybody bother to have set up a symbolic system that represents how non-materiality relates to materiality?
Yeah.
The void.
We've been talking a lot about the Tuatha De Danann on the show, and a few weeks ago we had Elena Danann on, and we were talking about it, and she had mentioned that they would study at a place in Gotland, and in the Tuatha mythology, they seem to have went to a place to learn from 4 other wizards, or whatever you call them, mystics. All these different sacred sciences, and they would have to stay there before they could go out. And it seems like maybe Skara Brae was one of these like colleges or institutes of training people, as well as Göbekli Tepe and other places. Is that kind of your
Yes.
conclusion also?
One of my books, a recent book called Tracing Orkney's Origins, researchers on Orkney have a problem. They don't know where the first farmers who arrived on Orkney came from. And every time they try to trace it, they come up with equivocal answers as to where they might have come from. But I realize that the mistake they're making is they'll take one artifact at a time. They'll take a breed of sheep that's very ancient that still exists on Orkney, And they say, okay, well, we know this was domesticated, first domesticated before 6000 BC in the Near East. But it might have arrived on Orkney through any number of different paths. It might have come across Europe, in the north or the south of Europe, or might have come by sea. It might have migrated over a long period of time. They don't know how it got there. The same is true of every other artifact they have. They can sometimes pinpoint an origin way, way back. They don't know how it arrived on Orkney. I took a different approach. I said, I know that the Orkney culture seems to preserve this ancient esoteric tradition, which involves clusters of elements of many different sorts. There are agricultural elements, there are linguistic elements, there are architectural elements, there are cultural elements like burial traditions and pottery styles. There are myths. So starting with the Göbekli Tepe era, which is in the south of Turkey, southeastern Turkey, around 9000 BC, we first see these clusters of elements. It turns out the clusters move hand in hand with each other across the Mediterranean, one island at a time, one major island at a time. Researchers in the Mediterranean, many of them believe that there was a deliberate attempt to colonize the major islands for agriculture. And so these coherent sets of elements were arriving on the islands as a recognizable set. And then agriculture being at least attempted. In some cases it was successful, in some cases it wasn't. Major island to major island. From there, it became clear to me that the tradition moved out Gibraltar and up the coast of Europe through the Hebrides to Orkney by around 3600 BC. You arrive on Orkney with a set of elements, original founding elements on Orkney at around 3600 BC, where every aspect of that culture is seen in similar form on Malta in the immediately preceding years. That's why you have the sleeping goddess shape of the architecture of the houses at Skara Brae. The sleeping goddess is was famously discovered on Malta. What it looks to me is as if a group of students who were originally from Crete were educated on Malta and then chose, after they were initiated, rather than going back to Crete, to move on to Orkney. And we can see that the evidence of that in the Faroese language, which I've talked about, one of the ancient languages on Orkney. On Malta, there's a megalithic site that overlooks an elephant-shaped island that the sun sets behind. The megalithic site is called Hagar Quim, and in the ancient language at the time, the word name Hagar Quim meant standing stones. You go to Orkney within 100 years later, you have the standing stones of Stennis, and you have an ancient name for Orkney that was Orkneyjar. In the Faroese language, Orca means to endure or to stand, and Kajarni means stones. So Orkneyjar, which they don't have etymology for, they don't know what it meant, reasonably in the Faroese language means standing stones. It's homage to Hagar Quim. You've got a bay next to the Skara Brae village called the Bay of Scale. You have a similar bay near Crete called the Bay of Crona. It's the bay is shaped in a certain way that represents the crown of a Near Eastern goddess that was tossed up into the heavens to create the constellation. Trying to think of
Polaris?
yeah, but right. No, it's not Polaris. It represents a crown. It might be Borealis. Same shape.
Aurora Borealis.
Right. So in the Faroese language, you actually have two words for crown. One is Skali, like the Bay of Scale, and the other is Krona, which is the Cretan word for crown. There are naming conventions for the tribes that come out of this tradition. I was talking about the Naki or the Naxi in Tibet. The word Naxi means the Xi is a bastardization of an Egyptian word Sakai that means to celebrate. The Dogon word is Sigi. Naxi means celebrates Na, it celebrates the mother goddess. The original Hebrew tribe, the Yahuda means praises Yah. Skael means celebrates El. El is a Near Eastern god who was a counterpart. He was a god of space, counterpart to Yah as a god of light in the Canaanite tradition. And the crown that was tossed up into heaven was El's consort or wife, Ashtera. So you have numbers of commonalities like that that point to the idea that someone who was very, very familiar with Crete, but also educated in the Maltese tradition, was responsible for founding Orkney. You have remains of a trying to what it's called. Remember what it's called. A very large bull that was only known to have been domesticated in two localities in the ancient world. One was the Near East, and one was along the northern coast of the Mediterranean. It's called an aurochs. They found that at the Ness of Brodgar on Orkney. It's not believable that a group of sedate farmers on Orkney brought a wild aurochs into their midst. That would literally be bringing a bull into a china shop. It would have created havoc. And the aurochs was like had the equivalent power to the best John Deere tractor, today. It was the top of the line agricultural implement to have. So somebody deliberately brought an aurochs, domesticated aurochs by sea to Orkney, just as it's clear they brought domesticated red deer to Orkney by sea. Someone had major seafaring skills. The aurochs had to have come from the area of the Mediterranean. The red deer likely came from the area of the Mediterranean. Many, many other elements that clearly came from the Mediterranean. It's the same establishing set of elements, of agricultural elements that you see all along the Mediterranean. You also see it down in the UK. At 2600 BC, at Durrington Walls next to Stonehenge, you have signatures of the Orkney tradition. You have someone built a stone house at Durrington Walls that is a precise match for one of the houses of the Skara Brae village, down to where the stone furnishings were placed, the dimensions and the layout of the structure and so on. The first stone placements at Stonehenge were a match dimensionally and number-wise, diameter-wise, and so forth for the Ring of Brodgar on Orkney from in the same era. Clearly, someone with megalithic stoneworking skills was brought from Orkney to Durrington Walls and to Stonehenge to spearhead that construction. They found both styles of pottery from Orkney at Durrington Walls. They found inscribed stones that are a match for some inscriptions found at the Skara Brae village. So it looks to me that the question was about whether there are eras of instruction. The two major eras of instruction I see are at Göbekli Tepe at 9000 BC and on Orkney starting at around 3600 BC. But there are other spots that have signatures of the same instruction. At 4000 BC, it was going on at Elephantine in the south of Egypt. One of the signatures is, in the early years, they would situate their instructional site in view of a single elephant-shaped mountain that they could watch the sun move behind and watch it progress back and forth during the seasons of the year. It created a natural agricultural calendar. I've found postings that are modern day postings by people who live in Elephantine saying, well, summer must be coming soon because I can see that the sun is setting further and further south behind that mountain. At Hagar Quim on Malta, you have an island called Filfla that the sun sets behind the same way. There are caves inside of Filfla where they found the skeletons of pygmy elephants. So there are elephant associations with the mountain also. On Orkney is the first time we find double mountains with a gap in between, and that pattern was repeated any number of places. At Abydos, by around 2900 BC, that someone established a cemetery for the earliest pharaohs in Egypt in view of two elephant-like mountains with a gap in between it. It's called Pega the Gap. And according to Om Seti, the name Abdu, which is where Abydos comes from, meant the desired mountain. Someone chose the site because of the mountains. And the burial chambers, the earliest burial chambers there, took the same form as the Dogon house and the Skara houses. In Egypt, it's understood that burial chambers are meant to represent houses. So there's lots of homage. 1,500 years later, when Akhenaten reestablished his capital further south, he picked a spot that was in view of the sun rising behind two mountains with a gap like the one at Abydos. He was trying to reestablish the religion. On Orkney, there's a standing stone called a watchstone that's a match for a foundation altar the Dogon place when they established their village. It's like a courtyard clock because a standing obelisk, a standing stone that serves as an obelisk, is a sundial. You can tell the time by it, but it's also a good marker as a gathering place for people. But on Orkney was the spot from which you could do the best observation of the solar effects behind the mountains of Hoi. Akhenaten placed a pillar that was a similar watch point for his mountains.
Interesting. Do you know what the the breakdown of the word institute is?
No, I don't. Do you have insight into where that came from?
No, I don't. But it's like instant oot is oot meaning of anything.
I would certainly look it up. The most productive way to deal with linguistics is to try to get back to the original term, because it's the original term. If it goes far enough back, that tells us something. And then after that, anything can happen to the words depending on what group migrated in or what group, things happen to language. So one of my complaints with my publisher is that they want to standardize terms. They don't like that the Dogon call it one thing and the Chinese call it another and the Egyptians call it another. They don't like that there are 15 different transliterations for the same term. But I try to explain to them there is very critical information potentially in these words that we don't want to cleanse that by standardizing all the terms to one term that might not be the right term. We want to pass every variant term on to whoever reads the book, because someone down the line is going to realize where the connection is.
Yeah, I agree. Etymology is really fun because there's the modern English language that we have now that's becoming a very singular, cross-correlated language across the entire world, has these very interesting esoteric attachments to them and archetypes to each letter. So you have this kind of strange esoteric mystical way of looking at etymology in the modern English language, that the people that created it were very tapped into ancestral knowledge and some higher esoteric echelons. But it's fun to do that, but sometimes you'll make some stretches where you're like, all right, bud, you might want to calm down with that etymological stretch, because when you do break down, like when I was saying earlier, like scarab, Ra, of course, right? You got the scarab and you got Ra, the sun god, but then you look it up into the actual Northwestern European languages, and I read that Brae meant hillside or mountain, and so they have you got to go to the source, like you're saying, absolutely. But it is fun to speculate, and I think it is
Yeah,
important
it
to do
is.
that from time to time.
Yeah, it is, because those resemblances very often are the beginning of an important interpretation. But understanding that some of them are just resemblances, and I mean there are only about 40 phonetic values represented in any language,
Hmm.
and so there's a high possibility of coincidence
Yeah.
that two meanings are going to be expressed using the same phonetic. So anytime that you have a resemblance as a starting point, then the trick is to find a way to anchor it. And you
Hmm.
need to be able to find a way to demonstrate that somebody in ancient times saw it that way. And
Yeah.
then you have something to work
Absolutely.
with. If
Absolutely.
the only one who sees it that way is me, I don't have anything.
Well, so one thing I wanted to bring up too, I know we're going on 2 hours here, so maybe we'll start winding down with some final questions. This has been such a fascinating chat. It's going to be a lot to relish in. Everyone's going to be supremely stoked. And we'd even love to have you back to go even deeper on all the other things. But one of the things that came up during this chat that I thought was interesting was Orca Islands, which are right on top of some tectonic activity in the Washington state, in the
Right.
Strait of Juan de Fuca. You have the Orca Islands, which is not Orkney. But then
Right.
I did do some quick Googling, and there are some stone structures on the Orca Islands as well. I was wondering if you had found any correlation into that, or if there's any crossover.
Well, there could be, because we know we have ancient settlements that go up through British Columbia and such things. So we have groups that were in that area, and we have direct signatures that connect back to my tradition. For example, in the Native American tradition, a Navajo roundhouse is the same structure and symbolism as Siberian yurt, one form of Siberian yurt. Another form of Siberian yurt is a much simplified form. It uh, is structurally and symbolically the same as a Native American teepee, and it's actually called a teepee. So we know that the same tradition that played out in Siberia, which is my tradition, has positive links coming down that coast. So I wouldn't be surprised if we found in the under the seawater evidence of stuff like that.
Oh yeah, and the mound building cultures. You have mounds all across Northwest Europe as well, and then archeo observatories. There's another proper term for that, but yeah, super beautiful, super beautiful. Dan, were you about to say something, sir? I didn't mean to cut you off there.
No, I was just gonna say, yeah, America too has lots of mounds all over the place. Um, do you see a significance to these mounds of what do you think they were used for? Modern day says that they were like burial tombs and whatnot, but we know from Egypt that the pyramids weren't necessarily burial tombs. So, what constitutes the mounds as the same? I guess.
Um, from an everyday practical level, I'm with John Burke that the mound structures were uh, it was worth the effort to build a mound structure to have the ability to enhance the fertility and productivity of your agricultural seeds.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's a motive I can see that's worth building a mound. But at the same time, there were also cosmological reasons to have it. There's instructional value. If we're trying to talk about um, energy at the level of superconductivity, the mound is an excellent tool for explaining how that works. Um, Also, it looks as if, okay, the fairy tradition we were talking
To
about,
affect environment.
we're tracking a tradition where we can see over time it gets more and more and more difficult to interface with the fairy cultures,
Mm-hmm.
that they become, there's an era in time where if you come back to the same spot a year later, you can find the same effect. There are time differences going on. The time span is extending, and the interface between the two domains is weakening. So um, it could very well be that some of these structures were there as a way to try to sort of hold open the energetics, to foster the right energetics, to hold open an energetic gateway that kept the connection between the two domains. I can see that as a possibility. I was talking about 14 domains of energy. The Great Pyramid, some researchers say the Great Pyramid has the capability of reproducing all of the frequencies of those domains of electromagnetism.
Wow.
So there might easily have been trying to connect back or communicate back to these other levels of consciousness going on. And that over time, it became progressively a harder task to accomplish because of the shifting energies.
Yeah.
And so the structures they needed to do that got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger.
So there's,
Also, an
go ahead.
indicator that some of the structures may have been at least assisted from the energetic side is, okay, when we're dealing with the quantum domain, there's something called the Planck length, which is the smallest length we're able to measure because of our relationship to how tiny that domain is. And from my perspective, the slowness of our time frame compared to the quickness of the time frame of the quantum domain, there's a minimum unit that's the smallest that we're capable of measuring. Now, if we're imagining somebody from an energetic side trying to influence things that happened here, depending on the time differential, there may have been a smallest unit they could measure. And that might explain why in early times you have 700-ton blocks used to build things. And as time went on, the blocks got smaller and smaller and smaller to the point where they were small enough for us to be the ones building the structure, not somebody more capable than us.
So just scaled down. So
Right.
something else we were talking about, I mean, we talk about it kind of commonly, and it's fun to talk to different authors and researchers about. One will have like a common question to a bunch of different amazing, smart, beautiful people like yourself. And so when it comes to the talk of weather manipulation of ancient times, there's a lot of talk that some of these ziggurats and temples could have the effect on the environment to induce some sort of weather manipulation. And I know the term weather manipulation kind of gives people a big, huge, broad conspiratorial mindset, but it can be very simple in a lot of my understanding. But at the same time, tying it to elementals and deities that have different elemental qualities. So last night we experienced severe thunder and lightning, like I was saying earlier. And, we know that gods and deities are associated with these different types of elements. So I'm wondering if you've ever come across that purposeful fire on a huge scale, purposeful rain creation, or the creation of specific storms in order to enact and talk with those deities.
I've come across the reverse of that. This is John Burke
Oh,
work again, because the energetics at the top of a pyramid are greatly enhanced from what they are at the base of the pyramid. And the structure of a pyramid is designed to focus energy to the top. So if you're using energy to enhance seeds, that the more the critical factor is separation of charges. We were talking about the positive and negative charges across the membrane in an organism. These structures are also characterized by separation of positive and negative charges. Inside the cairns, you have one set of charges rising up and the other set of charges descending, and the seeds were put in between. Okay, the more you can enhance that, the more of a fertility effect you get, a benefit you get. So placing a pyramid or a mound at a site that already has natural energetics, like a disconnected energy in the ground or whatever, or building it high enough so that it's likely to be impacted by an incoming storm, likely to be hit by an electric strike or so forth. Those are all bonuses to the fertilizing effect of the Aku. John Burke saw these little orbs as a byproduct of the structure.
Wow.
The Dogon and Egyptians see it the other way around. They're saying we're creating an atmosphere that's conducive to the Aku orbs to come in to fertilize the seeds. It's the Aku who are doing it. And we're just making it possible for them.
Yes. Oh man,
Right.
beautiful,
If you go
beautiful.
to very, very damp caves in certain situations, I've seen videos where a group of people taking simultaneous videos on different cell phones would record the motions of orbs, intelligent motions of orbs around them
Hmm.
coming into a very damp open cave, that kind of thing.
Beautiful, yeah. Like and people will say, when you go to a more humid climate, you have this like you feel like you're just encapsulated in like spiritual energy, like there's a breath of God there. And then you go to the desert and it's another type of spiritual energy, which is another type of elemental intact, and it's so fascinating and
Red
beautiful.
limestone,
Oh,
red limestone. The Dogon situated themselves along an escarpment that's all red limestone or sandstone. I'm sorry, red
wow.
sandstone, just like yeah, Sedona and places like that. Um, Also, we have been talking about pygmies being associated with these groups. They are worldwide. Pygmies are associated in the role of the teacher, or of the more divine, quote unquote, being. The Dogon are situated in a site where a group of pygmies are thought to have previously lived or might have lived contemporaneously with the Dogon originally, called the Telem. But the Dogon name for the Telem means we found them.
Tell them.
Modern interpreters say take that to mean we found them here when we arrived. I interpret it to mean there were reports they were here. We came here looking for them and we found
So go ahead and tell them. Wow. Yes,
them. Yeah.
that's beautiful.
But
Uh,
yes, at all the oracle sites and stuff in the Aegean, you
Mhm.
have pygmy reports. In Egypt, you have the pygmies depicted in glyphs and in statues and so forth. Native American tribes are very commonly associated with pygmies. Um, you have
Yeah.
them
It also
with the Picts and the Petty in Scotland.
kind of gets into like how the fairy mythology kind of formed into what it is now. They're little fairies, you know.
Right.
Now, whereas before they were substantial height or medium height or small stature, didn't matter. But now it's kind of depicted as in the short form. So that's kind of interesting. I looked up the etymology of oot, and it came back as several different things. It came back as origin, it came back as feminine, and it came back of as wealth and prosperity. So instant wealth, instant prosperity, or instant origin. Um, it's kind of fascinating when you think about instant origin
mhm.
or instant wealth. That knowledge of going to an institute and that higher learning.
Right.
It's pretty interesting.
One other point I wanted to make
Mhm.
about Abydos for millennia at Abydos, they would celebrate an annual Osiris festival that had included different aspects to it. But one of those things was sort of um, a sea chase game um, that was centered around the dismemberment of Osiris's body. Um, all of the same traditional aspects of that game are still observed in Kirkwall on Orkney every Christmas time. They have something called a ba game that is carried out where a ball represents the head of, of a mythical
Mhm.
figure that's being competed over. There are similar games that were preserved well into recorded history times on Crete in feminine cultures, played very much the same way with a lot of the same details of how it played out. Um, and the Orcadians don't even know that they're observing an Osiris festival, but it's all the same stuff,
Mhm.
down
Mhm.
to specific words and names of characters and things like that.
Wow.
Yeah, it's
And then you
fascinating.
got the ball game in South America as well. Um,
Right, that's right.
that that's
Aztecs.
it's yeah, the Aztec ball game. I forget the name of it. Some of their words are so incredibly complex. Trying to say it. I just found,
Yeah,
like just saying Quetzalcoatl is it's enough for me. But
Mm,
one of my final questions for you is going to be very simple, and
okay,
I'm excited to see what you say. Dragons.
dragons.
What are dragons?
Okay, symbolically, serpents and dragons represent energy. I had talked about the cyclical presence of magnetism for components of a proton. That takes the shape of a serpent. This is scrolling energy. It's a concept of energy that scrolls between domains. So any symbolism that involves an undulating serpent form, my immediate impulse is to say that it was representative of energy, and I would explore the words or the original names for whatever the dragon was to pinpoint what they were trying to talk about. In China, they're talking about energy with using dragons as a symbol. Um, the symbolism through the instruction was catered. It was, how can I say, tailored to the environment that the students came from, because the idea was your environment was supposed to reinforce the learning. So in India, you have a cobra. In Native America, you have a rattlesnake. Same symbol used to represent the same thing, but with an active attempt to try to make sure that it's tailored to the situation you're going to be living in.
That
So
makes a lot
dragons
of
are the
sense.
same way. I see them as a tailored form of that serpent symbol.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laird, for being on the show today. We appreciate your time. It's been very mind blowing. Lots of cool physics and philosophical insight into the origins of our humanity. Just from one like, hey, what's Skara Brae? Took us on this large journey across across all the galaxies.
If there's certain
Uh,
topics you find yourself wanting to drill down into, I'd be happy to come back and talk more focused on certain things.
yeah, we would love to have you back on.
Thank
Tell
you.
the people where they can find you at, your books, and what else you have going on.
Okay, there's an author page for me at simonandschuster.com and at innertraditions.com. And there's an author page for me on Amazon. The Amazon's an easy place to find the books. There's a used book site called adall.com where you can usually find a used copy at a lower price if the cost is a problem. The Egyptian hieroglyphs don't lend themselves very well to Kindle editions, so there aren't a lot of um, e-reader versions of the books I've written.
That's
Right now, I'm in the final editing phase of a book called The Waters of Life, where the discussion is on the energetics of and how they relate to biology. Um, that'll be out in the next month or so, probably. Um, I have a couple of other projects I'm working on. One of the things I've always wanted to do is to trace how I know that a certain symbol represents a certain things in terms of Egyptian glyphs. How do you know that this symbol represents this thing?
a
And what that
guidebook on
produces,
symbolism, Egyptian symbolism. That's fascinating.
well,
Great idea.
yeah, it's actually symbols in derived format. The goal is to never use a glyph to explain the meaning of another glyph that I haven't already defined. So I'm working from the earliest givens to um, the most complicated concept, working forward. Here's how we know it. Here's the reference in the Egyptian hieroglyphic dictionaries. Here's the comparative Dogon reference. This is why this symbol means this thing. And then that way, when somebody poses the question to me, I can copy and paste sections of the document and give them a precise statement of this is the rationale I have for why this symbol means this thing.
That'll be a great project. Excited for that to come out.
Cool. Do you do any conferences or cruises or anything like that?
I have been doing a couple of conferences a year prior to COVID. Since COVID, there really haven't been any. I actually ran a conference at a day of instruction at Vassar College one year. And I have considered possibly doing that again at some point. With the ease of Zoom, face-to-face Zoom type meetings.
Yeah.
Fewer people are willing to travel to go to a conference.
I know it's that it's such a dichotomous feeling because you want to go and have this really cool singular experience, but you can get a bigger audience if you promote it online. So it's that kind of tug and pull, like, what do we do? It's like a band trying to choose whether or not they
Both.
go on tour,
You do both.
Right.
You do both.
at
Yes,
the same
absolutely.
time.
Because people like us,
Televise the conference.
we do want to go. We do want to go. And
Right.
actually, you know what? I do prefer that. I actually prefer, instead of Zoom conferences where it's just like little bubbles on the screen, where it's like it's a really well recorded and well produced version of like Megalithomania or whatever, when they have, they're talking and you see the audience. It's still more a better feeling too. So just
And plus, you get the
fun stuff.
benefit of the knowledge of all the attendees, because everybody brings something
Mhm.
interesting to the conference.
Exactly.
Yes.
I've been invited to be speakers at certain conferences where the organizer will say, "Well, of course we can arrange so that you don't have to actually see anybody face to face." And I think that's the prize for me. I
Mhm.
lose 90%
Yeah.
of my benefit if I can't see the people meet the people face to face.
Energy
I get
exchange
as much from
too.
them as they get from me.
Yeah, the expression.
The idea of the auditorium itself was kind of built with energetic architectural design. And so when you have like everybody, focusing energy in one direction, it's actually kind of magnifying the stage, and it's magnifying, giving them, that's why you get this really nervous feeling. If you've ever done any stage stuff, like the first time you get on stage, you'll get a lot of stage fright. That's because you're literally getting projected a bunch of energy at you. But if you breathe and you do good, you can harness that and actually afloat through and get more power from the beautiful love that's being shared cohesively through everybody.
Right.
It's
So
fascinating.
to answer your question, do conferences less so since COVID.
Yeah.
Uh,
We'll bring it back. It'll happen. It's going to be great. I'm looking forward to that water book, the glyph book. He's got so many books that, yeah, it's just, it's awesome. Great to have you on, and stoked to chat again.
Well, thank you very much. I'd be happy to join you guys again some other time.
Cheers.
Excellent. Thank you, Laird.
Yep,
Thanks, Fire Tribe, for listening. And if you're not down with that, wake